Welcome back to Family Shadows, the channel where we explore the quiet battles, hidden sacrifices, and untold stories that happen within families. Stories that often mirror our own lives more than we'd like to admit. If you find meaning in these stories, if they make you pause and reflect on the value of family, love, and respect, then I invite you to gently click subscribe. It's a small act, but it keeps these stories alive, so that together we can honor the lessons family teaches us. Now, let's begin tonight's story. My daughter-in-law mocked me. If you want dinner, lick the table clean. Robert Miller was 62 years old, though the lines on his face carried decades more than that number suggested. Life as a carpenter had left his hands rough, his back slightly stooped, but his heart was still steady. Steady in the way a man's heart is when he has endured storms, buried a wife, and still managed to rise each morning with quiet dignity. That night, he sat at his daughter's dining table, a place that should have felt like sanctuary. A table is more than wood and screws, it's memory. It's where families once bowed their heads together, where laughter rolled between shared dishes, where silence could speak louder than words. Robert remembered when his late wife, Margaret, would set their own kitchen table with careful hands. She had a way of making even soup and bread feel like a banquet because it was offered with love. But tonight, love was absent. Nicole Evans, his daughter-in-law, moved around the table with sharp efficiency. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, her perfume too strong for a family meal. Robert had always tried to understand her, her hunger for status, her constant complaints about money, her way of speaking to him as though he were a child rather than the man who had raised the woman she married. Jason, her husband, Robert's son-in-law, leaned back in his chair with that easy arrogance of a man who believed the world owed him a favor. Emily, Robert's daughter, sat nervously between them, eyes darting toward her father and then down to her plate, as if afraid to witness what might unfold. Dinner began in uneasy silence. Plates clinked. Forks scraped. Robert tried to focus on the roast chicken, the smell reminding him of Sundays long ago when Margaret's hands basted a bird with butter and herbs. He wanted to say something kind, to tell a story about Emily as a child, maybe even to compliment Nicole on her cooking, though truth be told, the food lacked the warmth that made a meal whole. But before words could form, it happened. Nicole turned, carrying a dish of vegetables. As she set it down, she accidentally, though Robert knew better, knocked his plate to the floor. It shattered against the hardwood, chicken and potatoes splattering across his shoes. The room froze, and then Nicole's voice, sharp as glass. "Well, if you still want dinner, Robert, you can lick it off the table clean." Her lips curled into a smile that wasn't a smile at all. Jason chuckled. Emily gasped but said nothing, and Robert simply sat there staring at the ruined food, the silence ringing louder than her cruelty. There are insults a man can shrug off, a forgotten thank you, a careless joke. But there are others that sink deep into the bones, the kind that remind you you've been moved from the center of your own family to the margins. Robert felt that weight pressing down on his chest. He wanted to speak, to say how dare you, to rise and demand respect. But instead he reached for a napkin, his hands trembling slightly, and bent down to wipe the mess. His knees cracked as he crouched, his dignity bending with him. Emily whispered, "Dad," but her voice was too soft to pierce the cruelty in the room. Jason muttered, "Don't take it seriously, it's just a joke." But Robert knew jokes carry truth. A joke is often a dagger dressed in laughter. He dabbed at the table, his reflection caught faintly in the polished surface. For a moment, he saw Margaret's face there, her kind eyes, the way she would have never allowed such disrespect under her roof. A lump rose in his throat. What would you think if you saw this, Margaret? The mind has a cruel way of pairing the present with the past. As Robert cleaned, he remembered another dinner, 25 years earlier when Emily was 10. She had spilled an entire pot of soup onto the floor, bursting into tears. Margaret had knelt beside her, cupping her cheek, saying, "It's only soup, sweetheart, we'll make more, what matters is you." Back then, the mess was nothing. Love made it bearable. Tonight, the mess was everything because love was gone. Nicole poured herself wine, swirling it as if nothing had happened. Jason dug into his food. Emily stared at her father, shame burning her cheeks. Robert sat back down slowly, his appetite vanished. The table, once a place of unity, now felt like a battlefield. Each bite they took seemed louder, a drumbeat of his humiliation. The words licked the table clean echoed in his ears, not just an insult about food, but about worth, about whether he still belonged at the table of his own family. But Robert was not a man without strength. He had built houses with his bare hands, raised a daughter through grief, survived nights so lonely he thought his heart would stop beating. A cruel word from a bitter woman would not define him. He sat still, almost statuesque, letting his silence speak. He would not lash out, not tonight, but inside something shifted, a quiet resolve, a thought that would later become action. Respect is not demanded in noise. It is reclaimed in silence. Robert folded the napkin neatly, set it beside his empty plate, and rose from the table without a word. He walked to the door, his footsteps calm, measured. Before stepping out into the night, he glanced back once. His eyes met Nicole's, steady, unwavering, carrying a storm she could not yet see. And with that he left. The door clicked shut. Silence filled the house. But inside Robert's heart, something had begun to burn. Robert's footsteps echoed softly on the wooden porch as he stepped outside, leaving the warmth of the house for the cool evening air. He breathed in deep, the night carrying a scent of damp leaves and faint chimney smoke from neighboring homes. For a moment, he stood there, his hands gripping the railing, his eyes cast upward toward the darkened sky. Stars were hidden by clouds, just as his dignity had been hidden beneath Nicole's sharp words. He thought about going home, about reheating the leftover stew sitting in his refrigerator, about sitting at his small table in silence. But something in him resisted leaving too quickly. A part of him needed to linger, if only to remind himself that he was still family, even if uninvited, even if unwanted. When Robert stepped back inside, the clinking of utensils had resumed, the room filled with the awkward rhythm of forced normalcy. Nicole laughed lightly at something Jason said, though the sound carried no joy. Emily kept her head down, her fork barely moving. Robert lowered himself into his chair again. He didn't ask for another plate. He didn't speak. He simply folded his hands in front of him, the way a man does when words will not serve him. Nicole glanced his way, smirking as if she had won something. Jason shrugged and said, "Dad, it's fine, don't sulk." Robert's jaw tightened. He wanted to ask Jason if he knew the meaning of sulking. This wasn't sulking. This was holding together the last fragments of dignity after they had been shattered like porcelain on the floor. Emily finally broke the silence. "Dad," she whispered, almost pleading, "do you want me to fix you another plate?" Robert shook his head. "I'm not hungry anymore." His voice was steady, but it carried a weight that made Emily look away in shame. She remembered being a little girl, how her father always saved the last piece of pie for her, how he would eat less so she could have more. He had never once let her feel she was a burden. And now here he sat, stripped of his place at the table. Emily's lips trembled, but Jason's glare stopped her from saying more. She lowered her eyes, her hands twisting her napkin. Nicole leaned back in her chair, sipping her wine, her painted nails tapping against the stem of the glass. "Robert," she said casually as though speaking to a servant, "you know, maybe it's best if you eat at home from now on. Less confusion that way." Jason chuckled. "She's not wrong." Emily flinched. Robert closed his eyes briefly. He had endured insults on construction sites, jeers from strangers when times were lean, even the cruelty of fate when Margaret was taken from him too soon. But this cut deeper. To be told there was no seat for him at his own daughter's table. He saw Margaret's face again, soft and kind. He heard her voice. "A family table should never be a place of shame. It should be where we are safest." How strange that the very place that once healed his wounds now deepened them. Robert's mind drifted to Thanksgiving years ago. The house had been smaller then, the table old and wobbly, but Margaret had filled it with love. They had no money for a grand feast, yet everyone felt rich because they had one another. Even Jason, back when he first courted Emily, had been polite, deferential, eager to impress. Nicole hadn't been around yet. Now the table was large and polished, the food expensive, the house impressive, and yet it was barren of warmth. Dinner ended without Robert touching a bite. Jason and Nicole carried on their conversation as if nothing unusual had occurred. Emily excused herself to wash dishes, though her shoulders sagged with guilt. Robert rose quietly, picked up his coat, and walked toward the door. No one stopped him. No one said good night. On the porch again he paused, looking through the window at the family inside. For a fleeting moment he saw Emily glance up, her eyes following him with unspoken apology. But Robert turned away. He walked slowly down the street, his breath visible in the cold air, each step heavy with humiliation. Back in his own modest house, Robert set his coat on the chair, slipped off his shoes, and sat heavily at the kitchen table. The room was quiet, too quiet. He stared at the pot of stew he had left on the stove earlier. Hunger gnawed at him, but pride closed his throat. He poured himself a glass of water instead. His reflection wavered in the glass, tired eyes, a weary man who had given his life to building and providing, now treated as disposable. Robert whispered aloud, "Margaret, I don't know how much more of this I can take." His voice cracked. "I don't want to lose Emily, but they've made me a stranger in her house." Tears threatened, but he blinked them back. A carpenter does not weep at every splinter. Still, the splinter remained. Meanwhile, back at Emily's house, she stood at the sink, her hands in soapy water, staring out the window into the darkness. Her father's silhouette had long since vanished, but she could still feel his absence like a weight in her chest. Jason came up behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "Don't worry about it, he'll be fine, your dad's tough." Emily didn't answer. Instead, she thought of the look on her father's face, the quiet hurt in his eyes. She had seen it before once years ago when Margaret passed away. It was the same look of a man losing the center of his world. Nicole's voice rang out from the living room. "Honestly, Emily, you should be grateful. We give him a place to sit. He should respect that. If he can't handle a little joke, that's his problem." Emily dried her hands, pressing the towel too hard against her skin. She wanted to scream, but the words lodged in her throat. At home, Robert lit a small lamp and sat in his worn armchair. He opened the photo album he kept on the side table. There was Margaret on their wedding day, her veil fluttering in the summer wind. There was Emily as a baby, cradled in his arms, her tiny hand gripping his finger. He traced their faces with his calloused thumb. "I've done everything for you," he whispered to the past. "Why is it so hard now to be seen?" Outside, the wind rattled the windows. Inside, his heart ached with a loneliness deeper than the night. But beneath the sorrow, a seed was planted, a seed of resolve. Robert did not yet know what form it would take, but he knew this much: things could not remain as they were. The house finally settled into silence, both his and Emily's. But in two different homes, two hearts lay restless. Robert, nursing his shame in solitude. Emily, torn between loyalty to her husband and the love for her father. And Nicole, so certain in her triumph, so blind to the quiet storm she had stirred in the soul of the man she mocked. Robert woke the next morning to the pale light slipping through his thin curtains. The house was quiet, too quiet, no clatter of dishes, no footsteps on the stairs, no gentle humming of a woman making coffee. Those sounds had disappeared with Margaret, and though years had passed since her death, the silence still felt like a thief that broke in nightly, stealing what little warmth remained. He rose slowly, joints aching, and made himself toast and black coffee. The bread was stale, the coffee bitter, but he ate and drank it anyway. A man learns to swallow what life gives him, even when it tastes of disappointment. Robert sat at his small kitchen table, staring at the scarred wood surface. The scratches and dents told stories. Emily dropping her spoon when she was 4, Margaret setting down a hot pot without a trivet, his own hammer lying there once when he came in from the workshop too tired to put it away. He closed his eyes and the memories came rushing back. It was a Sunday afternoon 2 decades ago. The house smelled of roast chicken and rosemary. Emily, still in pigtails, skipped into the kitchen, nearly knocking over her glass of milk. Margaret laughed, not scolded. "Careful, sweetheart. This table's old, but it still holds us together." Back then, the food was simple, sometimes barely enough, but the love was plentiful. Every seat at the table was filled with belonging. Now, the table at Emily's house was larger, shinier, surrounded by wealth that Robert himself had quietly helped fund. But his place at it had vanished. After finishing breakfast, Robert went out to his workshop behind the house. The familiar scent of sawdust welcomed him like an old friend. Tools hung neatly on the wall, each one placed by his hand. Here, no one mocked him. Here, his worth was visible in every table, chair, and cabinet he had built. He ran his fingers along the edge of a wooden chest he had started months ago but never finished. Margaret used to say, "Wood remembers the touch of the hand that shapes it." He wondered if families were the same. Did Emily remember his hand guiding hers when she first learned to hold a pencil? Did she remember how he sat up nights to finish her school projects, or the way he worked double shifts to buy her a prom dress? Robert sighed. Nicole certainly didn't remember because she had never cared to know. And Jason only remembered what Robert still owned, not what he had given. That afternoon across town, Emily folded laundry in silence. Her mind drifted back to childhood. She remembered a winter evening when their furnace had broken. She had cried, shivering under blankets, but her father had built a fire in the old stove and told her stories until she fell asleep. Back then, she thought he was invincible. Now, seeing him mocked at her own table, she felt like she had betrayed the very man who had never let her down. Jason walked into the room, scrolling on his phone. "What's for dinner?" he asked casually. Emily swallowed her anger. "I don't know yet." He didn't notice the tears she blinked away. Night fell again, and Robert sat by the window looking out at the quiet street. He thought of calling Emily, of telling her how much last night had hurt. But he didn't. Fathers, especially widowed fathers, often carry their pain alone. Instead, he opened his old ledger where he kept every receipt, every mortgage payment, every check he had written to support Emily and Jason over the years. The numbers told a story no one else seemed to remember. How many times he had bailed them out, how much of his own savings had gone to their emergencies. Robert whispered into the silence, "Respect is worth more than money, and yet somehow I've given both and lost both." As he closed the ledger, Robert felt something stir within him. Not anger, not yet, but a quiet awakening. Memories of love reminded him of who he had been, and shame reminded him of who he had become in their eyes. Between the two, a question formed. What will I do with the years I have left? It was the kind of question that didn't demand an immediate answer, but once asked, it refused to go away. Robert turned off the light and sat in darkness. The echoes of the past lingered around him. Margaret's laughter, Emily's childhood voice, the clink of dishes in a home that once overflowed with belonging. And now those echoes whispered of something else, change. The next Friday evening, Robert found himself once again at Emily's house. He had debated all afternoon whether to go. Part of him wanted to stay home to avoid the sting of Nicole's sharp tongue and Jason's careless arrogance. But another part of him, a deeper, more stubborn part, refused to surrender his place in his daughter's life. So he went. He brought along a pie he had baked himself, apple with cinnamon, the way Margaret used to make it. His hands weren't as steady anymore, and the crust had cracked on one side, but it smelled of warmth and memory. When he arrived, Emily greeted him at the door. "Hi, Dad," she said softly, taking the pie. Her eyes carried a quiet gratitude, though her smile didn't quite reach them. Inside, Nicole was setting the table. The shine of polished silverware, the clink of glass, everything looked picture perfect, but Robert knew appearances often hid the deepest fractures. Dinner began with the usual small talk. Jason talked about a new deal at work. Nicole boasted about a shopping trip. Emily asked about the weather, her voice barely above a whisper. Robert listened, nodding politely. He said little. He had learned that in this house, his words carried less weight than the chair he sat on. As plates were passed around, he carefully placed a small portion on his dish, not wanting to burden anyone. He offered the pie he had brought, but Nicole waved a hand dismissively. "Maybe later," she said. "We're watching our sugar." Jason smirked. "Dad still thinks pie solves everything." Robert smiled faintly, though his chest tightened. He set the pie aside. Halfway through the meal, Nicole leaned back, swirling her wine, her eyes locked on Robert. "You know, Robert," she said casually, "maybe it's better if you don't come to dinner every week. You're set in your ways, and honestly, sometimes it's exhausting." Jason laughed. "She's right. You still live like it's the 80s. No offense, Dad, but you're out of touch." Robert froze. His fork hovered above his plate, then lowered slowly. Out of touch. Exhausting. Words that stung more than any slap could. Emily's face flushed. "Jason." "Nicole, please," she began, but Nicole cut her off. "No, Emily, someone has to say it. He sits here like a ghost, doesn't eat, doesn't talk. What's the point? It's like having an old piece of furniture at the table." Her words hung in the air like smoke, choking everyone. Robert's hand trembled. He placed the fork down carefully, the sound of metal against porcelain louder than thunder in the still room. He folded his napkin, smoothing out every crease. He looked at Emily, his daughter, who once sat on his shoulders at the county fair, who once called him her hero. Her eyes now brimmed with tears she could not shed. Then he turned to Nicole. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, his gaze, steady, unwavering, held hers. It was the gaze of a man who had built a life with sweat and calloused hands, a man who had buried love and carried on, a man who had been diminished but not destroyed. Nicole shifted uncomfortably, though she masked it with another sip of wine. Jason cleared his throat. "Dad, don't make this dramatic, we're just being honest." Robert rose slowly from his chair. His back ached, but he stood tall, taller than he had in years. He picked up his coat, draped it over his arm, and placed one hand on the back of his chair. He did not shout. He did not curse. He did not beg. He simply said, his voice low but unshakable, "I built tables with these hands, but tonight I see there are some tables not worth sitting at." Emily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Jason rolled his eyes. Nicole smirked again, but the smirk didn't reach her eyes this time. Robert walked to the door, each step measured, deliberate. He paused for just a moment, long enough for Emily to whisper, "Dad, please," but he didn't turn back. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Inside, the family table felt emptier than ever. Emily's tears fell silently into her lap. Jason reached for his wine glass, pretending nothing had happened. Nicole sat still, unsettled by the quiet authority of Robert's final words. And outside, under the weight of the night sky, Robert breathed in deeply, his chest heavy, his heart wounded. But something inside him had shifted. He had reached the breaking point. And once a man breaks, he does not always stay broken. The night after Robert's quiet stand, he lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The words he had spoken, "Some tables are not worth sitting at," echoed in his ears. They had not been planned, they rose out of him like breath from a drowning man. But now, lying in the dark, he realized something had shifted inside. For years he had given checks, co-signed loans, help with mortgage payments, a new car when Jason's old one broke down, even covering tuition for his granddaughter's private school. He had thought of it as love, as duty, as what Margaret would have wanted. But love without respect becomes a leash, and he had been pulled along long enough. At dawn, Robert sat at the kitchen table, his old ledger spread before him. The book was thick, worn, its pages filled with neat rows of handwriting, his careful record of every dollar spent. He ran his finger down the entries. $2,000 Jason's business opportunity. $4, 500 Nicole's emergency dental work. $1, 200 new refrigerator for Emily's house. $3, 800 tuition deposit. Mortgage payments month after month written in steady ink. Beside some entries he had written a single word, gift. Beside others, loan, but in truth few had been repaid. Robert closed the book. He wasn't angry, not in the loud, burning way of rage. His was a cooler fire now, the kind that smolders and reshapes everything in silence. Later that week, Robert put on his best jacket and went to the bank. The young teller smiled politely, not knowing the storm of dignity carried in the old man's step. "I'd like to make some changes to my accounts," Robert said calmly. Within an hour, the joint credit card Jason and Nicole used freely was canceled. The automatic mortgage payments Robert had shouldered for years were redirected back into his own account. He left the bank lighter than he had felt in years. Not because of money, but because for the first time in a long time, he felt he had drawn a line. That evening Emily called, her voice trembled. "Dad, the bank says the mortgage payment didn't go through. Did something happen?" Robert closed his eyes. He could hear the strain in her voice, the pressure Nicole and Jason must have already put on her. "Emily," he said gently, "I've carried that house for a long time. Longer than I should have. It's time you and Jason manage it yourselves. Dad, you know Jason's business is struggling. Emily," he interrupted softly. "I've struggled too, for decades, and I did it so you would never feel ashamed. But last week, I was made to feel smaller than the dust on the floor. I can't keep feeding the mouths that spit on me." There was silence on the line, then a faint sob. "I'm sorry, Dad. I don't want your apology," Robert whispered. "I just want your respect." The next night, Nicole stormed into Robert's house unannounced. Her heels struck the floor like hammers, her perfume arriving before her words. "What is this?" she snapped, waving a letter from the bank. "You think you can just cut us off after everything we've done for you?" Robert sat in his armchair, calm, steady. "After everything I've done for you," he corrected. Nicole's face flushed. "We've given you a place at our table. We've let you see your granddaughter whenever you want, and this is how you repay us." Robert's eyes narrowed slightly. "A place at the table is not a gift when it comes with humiliation, and seeing my granddaughter is not yours to grant, it is her right and mine." Nicole sputtered, unused to his quiet firmness. "Jason will hear about this." Robert leaned back. "I expect he will." And then he said nothing more. Silence has a way of ending a conversation better than shouting ever could. Later that night, Emily came by. She didn't storm, she didn't shout. She simply sat on her father's couch, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes red from crying. "Dad," she whispered, "I don't know what to do. Jason is furious. Nicole says you're trying to ruin us. But I saw your face the other night, and I can't stop seeing it. You looked broken." Robert reached over, placing his calloused hand on hers. "Not broken, Emily, bent maybe, but bending can lead to standing straighter than before." She began to cry again, quietly. He let her. Sometimes a father's greatest act is not fixing, but simply being the place where his child can finally weep. As the days passed, the ripples grew. Jason's credit cards declined at dinner. Nicole had to explain why the luxury purchases stopped. Bills arrived without Robert's invisible hand paying them. The shiny world they had built began to crack. And Robert, he felt no glee in their struggle. Quiet justice is not about revenge. It is about balance. For the first time in years, Robert sat at his own table, a simple meal before him, stew, bread, and the pie he had saved for himself. He ate slowly, savoring each bite. The table was small, the room silent, but his dignity sat beside him like an honored guest. Robert lifted his glass of water, raised it slightly toward the empty chair across from him, and whispered, "To you, Margaret, I think you'd be proud." And though the chair remained empty, Robert could almost swear he felt her smile. The following Sunday, the Evans household sat down to dinner without Robert. The chairs were all filled, Jason at the head, Nicole at his right, Emily at his left, and little Chloe between them. But the room felt strangely hollow. The absence of the old man was louder than any conversation that tried to replace him. The roast sat heavy on the table, the wine glasses gleamed, yet no one lifted their forks with ease. Jason cleared his throat. "So we'll figure it out," he said, stabbing a piece of meat a little too forcefully. "It's just money, we'll manage." But Nicole's eyes betrayed her worry. Her credit card had been declined twice that week. The bank had called about late fees, and the mortgage, always quietly handled in the background, was now very present, sitting like a vulture on her shoulder. Emily picked at her food, her appetite gone. She kept glancing at the empty chair, the one Robert used to occupy. It was just a chair of oak and cushion, but tonight it felt like a monument to everything missing. Nicole slammed her wine glass down a little too hard. "It's humiliating," she hissed. "Do you know how it feels to stand at the store with a line of people behind you and hear them say declined? Twice." Jason sighed. "I'll fix it. My deal will come through soon." "You've been saying that for 2 years," Nicole snapped. "We had stability when your father was helping, now look at us." Emily's fork clattered onto her plate. "Don't blame him," she said softly. "He gave more than he should have, we all know it." Nicole turned on her. "Of course you defend him, you always run to Daddy." Emily's cheeks burned, but she didn't answer. The silence returned, heavier than before. Across town, Robert sat at his own table that same evening. His meal was simple: a bowl of stew, a slice of bread, and the pie he had saved from earlier in the week. There was no laughter, no conversation, but there was peace. And peace, Robert realized, was worth more than gold when it was bought with dignity. He looked at the empty chair across from him, the one that belonged to Margaret for so many years. He raised his glass of water slightly. "To better days," he whispered, and somehow, though the room was empty, he felt less alone than he had at Emily's crowded table. Later that night, after Chloe was asleep and Jason and Nicole had retreated to their bedroom to argue in muffled voices, Emily drove to her father's house. She knocked softly, almost hoping he wouldn't answer because she didn't know how to explain the turmoil in her heart. But Robert opened the door, his eyes kind, his expression steady. "Emily," he said, "come in." She stepped inside, glancing at the modest living room, the worn armchair, the quiet lamp. It wasn't grand. It wasn't shiny, but it felt safe. "I miss you at dinner," she confessed, her voice breaking. Robert nodded. "I miss what dinner used to be, not what it became." Emily sank onto the couch. "They don't understand, Dad. Jason thinks you're punishing us. Nicole says you're selfish, but I know the truth. I saw your face that night, and I can't forgive myself for sitting there while she," her words choked off. Robert sat beside her, placing a hand on hers. "Emily, you don't owe me an apology. You owe yourself honesty. Ask yourself what kind of table you want your daughter to grow up at. One where respect is served, or one where mockery is the main dish." Emily's tears spilled freely now. "I want Chloe to know the man I grew up with. The man who worked until his hands bled just to keep food on the table. I don't want her to see you treated like that." Robert squeezed her hand gently. "Then you know what needs to change." Back at Emily's home, the house felt colder than usual. Jason paced in the study, muttering about failed deals. Nicole scrolled furiously on her phone, searching for ways to refinance, her nails clicking against the screen. But Chloe, sweet Chloe, looked at the empty chair at dinner and whispered, "Where's Grandpa?" Emily's heart shattered. She kissed her daughter's forehead and said, "He's at his own house tonight, darling." But inside, she knew Chloe felt the same emptiness she did. As the days passed, the Evans house grew quieter. Meals were shorter, conversations sharper, laughter rarer. The table, once a place of performance and pretense, had become a reminder of what they had driven away. And Robert, though alone, began to feel the faint stirrings of freedom. He had lost his seat at their table, yes, but he had regained something far greater, the unshakable truth that dignity, once reclaimed, fills every empty chair with meaning. It was a Wednesday evening when Robert returned to Emily's house. He had not been there since that night, the night when his words about tables had left the room in stunned silence. Tonight, however, he did not arrive with pie or stew or an apology. He arrived with a folder tucked neatly under his arm, his shoulders straighter than they had been in years. When Emily opened the door, her eyes widened. "Dad," she breathed. Robert gave her a small smile. "Is Jason home?" She hesitated, then nodded. Jason was in the living room pouring himself a drink. Nicole sat on the couch, scrolling her phone with exaggerated boredom. When Robert entered, they both looked up in surprise. "Well, look who decided to come back," Jason said, his words laced with sarcasm. Nicole crossed her legs, smirking. "Here to turn the bank back on, Robert. Realize you can't survive without us." Emily winced. Robert walked to the table and set the folder down. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled out a chair, not the one he used to sit in, but the one at the far end of the table. He sat, his presence commanding despite the simplicity of his movements. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of the wall clock. Finally, Robert said quietly, "I came to explain, not to argue, not to beg, just to tell the truth." Jason snorted. "Truth? Dad, the truth is you've made things harder on everyone. We depended on you, and you cut us off." Robert's gaze sharpened. "Exactly, Jason, you depended on me too much, and in that dependence you forgot something, respect." Nicole rolled her eyes. "Respect? You think respect pays bills? You think respect keeps the lights on?" Robert leaned forward, his hands folded. "No, but respect keeps a family whole, and when it disappears, money cannot save what's already broken." Emily's throat tightened. She could feel something rising in her father's voice, something steady, powerful, unstoppable. Robert opened the folder. Inside were legal papers stamped and notarized. He slid them across the table toward Jason and Nicole. "What's this?" Jason asked, frowning. Robert's voice was calm, almost gentle. "That is the trust I've established. Every dollar I've saved, every asset I own, the house, the land, the workshop, it's all been placed into a trust in Margaret's name, and that trust is for one person only, Chloe." Emily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Jason's face went pale. You can't just—" "I can," Robert interrupted softly, "and I have." Nicole snatched the papers, her eyes darting over the words. "This is ridiculous. You're freezing us out." Robert shook his head. "No, I'm protecting the future. I built my life with my hands. I will not watch it be squandered by those who laugh while I'm humiliated. Chloe will have her education, her stability, her chance at a life untainted by greed. That is my final gift to Margaret and to Emily's daughter." His eyes flicked to Nicole. "But as for you, you will never again use my name or my work to live beyond your means." Jason slammed his fist on the table. "You think you can just control us like that after everything we've done for you?" Robert's voice cut him off like steel. "Done for me? Tell me, Jason. Which of those payments in my ledger was for me? The business bailouts, the mortgage, the cars, or was it all for you? What you've done for me is mock me, belittle me, and let your wife treat me like a servant at the table I helped pay for." The room went silent. Nicole's face flushed crimson. Jason's mouth opened, but no words came, and Robert sat taller than he had in years. Emily stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. "Dad," she whispered, "I didn't know you'd done this, all of this, for Chloe, for us." Robert turned to her, his expression softening. "I don't want thanks, Emily. I don't want apologies. I just want you to remember who you are, and who raised you. Don't let them take that from you." Emily sobbed openly now, rushing to embrace him. For the first time in years, she felt like the little girl who used to sit on his shoulders, who once believed her father could carry the weight of the world. And tonight she realized he still could. Robert stood, gathering his folder. He looked at Jason and Nicole one last time. "I built this home with my hands," he said, his voice low but resolute. "And if I'm not respected at its table, then no one eats at it." Then he turned, walking toward the door. This time he did not pause. This time he did not look back. The door shut with quiet finality, and inside the house felt emptier than it had ever felt before. The night Robert walked away, the Evans household fell into a silence thicker than stone. Jason poured himself another drink, though his hands trembled as he did. Nicole paced the living room, muttering curses under her breath, the trust papers still clenched in her fist. They had built their lives like a house of cards on the foundation of Robert's sacrifices, and now, with a single move, he had pulled it all away. Emily sat quietly at the edge of the couch, her face wet with tears. She wasn't crying because of the money. She was crying because she had seen something in her father's eyes that she hadn't seen in years. Unbroken strength. The following morning, Emily drove Chloe to school. In the car, Chloe asked the question Emily dreaded. "Mommy, why doesn't Grandpa come to dinner anymore?" Emily's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She swallowed hard. "Because sometimes people forget how important he is, but we'll make it right." Her voice cracked, but Chloe smiled softly. "Grandpa always makes me feel important. He tells me stories. He listens." Emily blinked back tears. She realized then that the respect Robert demanded was not just for himself, it was for Chloe too, so that she would grow up knowing the value of dignity, of kindness, of never letting anyone treat her as less than she was. As weeks passed, Jason's so-called deal collapsed. The investors pulled out. The bills piled higher. Nicole's shopping sprees came to a sudden halt, her glamorous posts on social media replaced with silence. The house, once full of noise and boasting, became filled with arguments whispered behind closed doors. But no matter how much they schemed, the truth remained. The easy flow of money was gone, and in its place grew the memory of Robert's calm voice, his steady words. "If I'm not respected at this table, then no one eats at it." Meanwhile, Robert's life grew quieter but richer in ways unseen. He tended to his workshop again, finishing the wooden chest he had once abandoned. He planted tomatoes in the small garden Margaret used to love. Most evenings, he sat with Emily and Chloe when they came to visit, just the three of them sharing stew, bread, and laughter. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't loud, but it was real. Emily often apologized still, tears filling her eyes, but Robert always shook his head. "Respect isn't found in words, Emily. It's found in actions, and you're here, that's enough." One Sunday, Emily brought Chloe over with a pot of food. They set the table together, nothing more than soup and pie, but it felt like a feast. Chloe climbed into Robert's lap and whispered, "Grandpa, this feels like home." Robert kissed the top of her head. "It is home, sweetheart. Wherever respect and love live, that's where home is." Emily reached across the table, taking her father's hand. In that moment, Robert knew, though the wider family had fractured, the heart of it had been restored. His place at the table was no longer questioned. It was cherished. Robert had been mocked, belittled, and cast aside. Yet he had not chosen bitterness. He had chosen dignity. His quiet justice had spoken louder than any shout, and in the end, respect, once lost, had been restored. Because family cannot be built on wealth or appearances or convenience. It can only be built on love, gratitude, and the simple but sacred act of honoring those who came before us. And so, dear friends, that is the story of a father's silent endurance and the quiet justice that restored his dignity. Here on Family Shadows, we tell these stories not just to pass the time, but to remind ourselves of the lessons that matter most. That respect is the cornerstone of family.